Bodies of Tigrayan women were used as battlefields, and rape was used as a weapon of humiliation. The attacks were intentionally committed to ensure a lasting physical and psychological impact on the women and the people in general. Historically, conflict-related sexual violence has been a study by the National Violence Against Women Prevention Research Center at Medical University of South Carolina showed that almost one-third of all rape victims developed post-traumatic stress disorder sometime during their lifetime, and more than 1 in 10 rape survivors still have post-traumatic stress disorder today. Sisana Kidana is a psychiatry professional and assistant lecturer at Ma'ala University. According to Sisana, survivors of sexual violence mainly struggle due to 2 types of mental disorders: depression and post-traumatic stress disorder.
Extreme anxiety, boredom, and losses of hope, sadness, and feeling weak all the time. These are some of the signs of depression. Survivors might also show loss of interest to hang out with their families and friends, even if they liked to do it before. So loss of interest is one of the symptoms. Another symptom is sleeping disturbance. Some of them might sleep all the time, but others might struggle to sleep. Eating disorder is also another symptom. Some of them might eat too much, and some of them might not have an appetite at all. There is also a self-loath and criticism, which leads to suicide. Post-traumatic stress disorder. The second and mainly seen among survivors of sexual violence is post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a mental trauma that comes after an assault. Almost all symptoms are similar with symptoms of depression. The only different symptoms are having flashbacks of the moment and nightmares. Zoning off and relieving that traumatic moment while they're sitting with their families and friends is also seen. Avoiding places, people, and events that remind them of that moment is also one of the symptoms. For example, when survivors see someone in camouflage, they might run away or change course on the road. They might also change their route to avoid the place where the incident had happened. Survivors also withdraw or isolate themselves from the rest of the community due to change of attitude towards themselves and the world.
Many believe that transitional justice has the potential to play a crucial role in the healing and reintegration of women victims of conflict-related sexual violence and children born out of war. But in most cases, conflict-related sexual violence is overlooked in peace talks. Women and girls have been forced to live in a hell-like situation in Tigray, with the world watching from the sidelines. Mulu thinks that the failure of the international community to do what's right on time has encouraged the perpetrators to re-invade Tigray and finish what they've started, as Eritrean and Amhara forces continue to operate in parts of Tigray, committing heinous crimes.
ፍትሒ ዓሚል ተፈጸመ 2013 ተፈጸመ ላፍቱ ፕሮሰስ ተዝእተ ነይሩ ካልኣይ መጽኦም እንደገና ተጠናኺሮም ኣይማእተይና ነይሩ
If justice had been served for what had been done last year and the year before, or at least if the process had begun, they wouldn't have reinvaded Tigray and inflicted all of these damages again. The perpetrators are our neighbors. We live together. They were in Tigray and they were forced out, and now they're back in most parts of Tigray, committing even worse crimes. We don't have a guarantee that this won't happen in the near future if justice isn't served.
Mulu also adds that the indifference by the international community has a huge role in worsening the mental suffering of the survivors. According to Mulu, many survivors in Tigray are willing to share their stories, to relive that tragic moment every time they speak to media stations or human rights organizations, and they expect one thing in return: for justice to be served, and for this to be the last crime of its kind. But more than 2 years into the war, they're still waiting for the world to hear their cries and hold the perpetrators accountable.
ካብኡሉ ይሞታሉ ነዋ ድምፀን ሂበን ህይወተን ባዕለን ነጥፋለ አለ መጀመሪያ ድምፀ ለሃበትና ተገላሊትና በህይወታ ዓርሰ ቅትለት ፈጽማ ባዕላ ልሞተት እያ ብዙሓት ዓርሰ ቅትለት ፈጽማ ነው
The survivors want the whole world to know about what's happening to women in Tigray. We had many survivors who committed suicide after sharing their stories with the world. Our first service recipient committed suicide after sharing her story with the international media stations. We watch and stop many survivors from inflicting harm on themselves on a daily basis. This is because the international organizations and media stations are always speaking about the problem, but nothing is done so far.
Experts say social stigma is another negative impact on the well-being of survivors. According to Sisana, societal norms and traditions play a major role in healing or breaking these survivors. She says that the first mistake in the context of the victim's society is trying to hide survivors away from their community. According to Sisana, stigmatizing victims leads to isolation and suicide.
أو كابينا ونعزوت أيو مسوهل تتحيزون أمنت تعات كبتحت له كندي تقدادي مكان حكمنا وسيد كأدلا يزخون حكمنا خطركب مدففع كتحبع سكي سمع لا مستر كتعقوه.
What we usually see in our community is that when a woman gets sexually assaulted, her family locks her up in the house in fear of everybody learning about the incident instead of rushing her to a hospital. The other thing is when a woman gets pregnant from a rape, one side of the community tells her that abortion is a sin and that she should keep the baby. The other side stigmatizes her by telling her not to give birth and raise an enemy's child, but the decision should be hers. These types of things might worsen the situation.
ካልእ ኣብ ሓዳር ወይ ገለ ክኾን ተሎ ድማ ጾታዊ ጥቃዕ ዝበፅሓ ትኾን ተላ ድሕሪኡ ካብ ሓዳራ ምፍታሕ ይመጽእ እዩ
When the survivor is married, divorce might come after the assault. This leads to self-isolation, as I mentioned before. Self-isolation leads to self-loath that might lead to depression, in the end suicide.
Despite the depths and complication of this crisis, Sisana thinks that healing is possible, but she also adds that enough help and resources from governmental and non-governmental organizations are vital.
Healing is possible. But what we have to keep in mind is that the healing process, the length might vary from a person to person. Some might show symptoms and some might not. Even if they were gang raped for days, some of them might heal very fast and it might take time for others. But to prevent length recoveries, we should take survivors of sexual violence to a hospital as soon as possible. Support from family, friends, and our community also play a huge role. When there's also enough support from governmental and non-governmental organizations, the healing process will be faster.
Mulu, on her part, condemns the presence of external forces and the continuation of atrocities in Tigray, and fears that the peace deal might be overshadowing the reality on the ground.
ጽቡቕ ሃዋህው እኒኦ ግን እስካዕ ኸዚ ሰላም ተተባሂሉ ሰብ ኩሉ ነገር ኣብ ዕፅዋ ይኾን ባይሉ ሰኣናዩ እስካዕ ኸዚ ይረኸብናዩ መድሓኒት ሲእና ነርና ሕዚ እውን ምስኣን ኣለና
The signing of peace deal is good, but ever since the signing of the deal, not much has changed. We used to struggle due to lack of medication, lack of food, and starvation. We continue to struggle due to these things. We have survivors from 2020 still waiting for treatment, and many are adding to that number on a daily basis. Last year, we used to receive survivors accompanied by at least one family member, but now they come all alone because their family members are slaughtered in their houses, and the troops force them to lock their houses and leave without burying them. We recently received a 10-year-old who came all alone. On top of their physical wound, many go crazy due to these events. So to be honest, things are getting worse, not better.
Experts say that early stage of a peace process is vital time to signal zero tolerance for sexual violence and commitment by all parties to prevent it, as these early stage agreements such as humanitarian access and confidence building measures help address conflict-related sexual violence by providing specialized services to victims and their communities, humanitarian presence, or human rights observers in the conflict zone. They underscore this can act as a deterrent to armed groups from committing sexual violence. But the reality in Tigray is far from this. Thousands of women and girls in most parts of Tigray still continue to face horrendous crimes by invading forces, and thousands more live in fear that this might be their fate if the implementation of the signed peace deal goes as weakly as it's going. The world has been singing, "Justice delayed is justice denied," demanding for a swift action that still remains paper value. But for the women in Tigray, both the denial and the delay still aggravate their unforgettable pain. The question remains, will justice ever be served? Will the cries remain in vain? Can a lasting peace be achieved by ignoring justice in the name of peace deal?